So I'm trying to figure out if I would ever live in a tiny house. Like, we're talking a really tiny house, like a house that's no more than maybe 2 or 3 times the size of this room that I'm sitting in. I don't exactly have that option out here in Arizona, but there are a couple of communities that are popping up around the country in places like Oregon and Texas, where they've built mini subdivisions of these 200 to 400 square foot homes. And these things are a huge hit, especially in Redmond, Oregon. Apparently the tiny homes here are selling so well that the developer is trying to build even more. If you look at the trend on social media, it's obvious that people have become pretty obsessed with living in small spaces. We've got people nowadays living in vans. People are living in yurts, which are basically just tents. People are living in school buses, and some people are even living in tree houses. Today, let's talk about this whole tiny home movement and whether or not this is just some trend or if we should expect to see more developers building entire communities of tiny homes going forward. What I found pretty interesting right off the bat is that this is actually a relatively new concept. The first modern tiny houses only started to appear around 20 years ago. Oddly enough though, living in small spaces has gained even more popularity with every year that has passed. People just feel like they have way more room than they need. They crave decluttering their life, or a big one lately is that they just simply can't afford a regular sized house. What a lot of people probably think about when they consider a tiny house is something like this that's basically just like a little box almost that looks like a shed that you put in your backyard. Or maybe you've seen something like this on social media where a bunch of tiny houses are built kind of right next to each other. Communities like this are typically built out to be rented on Airbnb. Or a lot of times you see pictures of tiny houses that do have really tiny footprints, but then they've got these huge walls of glass that just look out into nature. To be considered a tiny home, you need to be under 400 square feet, but the idea is they come outfitted with everything a regular home has, like a kitchen, a bathroom, a place to sleep, and a place to hang out when you're not sleeping. And YouTubers, by the way, have definitely played their part in making the tiny home movement even more popular. One in particular is a guy named Rob Built. If you've never heard of him, his channel is a lot of fun, and it initially got big when he started documenting the build of a tiny home he did in Joshua Tree. Then there's this other YouTuber group called Living Big in a Tiny House. Their entire channel is dedicated to showing off the coolest tiny homes all around the world. The point is, these tiny homes are no doubt trendy. They're fun to look at and fantasize about for sure, but a lot of people are looking at living in small spaces as a very real and practical way to live. So that's why developers started building entire communities of these things. This region of Central Oregon around Bend and Redmond has had a good amount of tiny home development over the last couple of years. Apparently, tiny homes are allowed across all of Oregon, especially in the big counties, which makes it one of the most progressive states when it comes to the tiny home movement. They've got pretty specific regulations out here laid out depending on whether your tiny home is permanent, meaning it's going to be attached to a foundation, if it's temporary, meaning it's going to be built on a chassis or a frame, or if it's transitional, meaning it's a home that's more meant for people who don't have homes. Check it out, I want to show you guys this one. So this builder is called Hiatus Homes. Their community here is called Benham. They did this one in Bend, Oregon. What they did here is they built 22 tiny homes. Each one of them are 598 square feet, and they kind of built them like in a circle where they're all like surrounding this community area, and they're very cool. Look at them, they're like kind of wooden and modern. They were completed almost 4 years ago. They only needed 3 acres to pull this whole thing off, and each one of the units is a lofted 1-bedroom, but they do have a second loft, which is good for either storage or for weekend guests. This website here, Contemporist, I guess they went and actually toured these things. So you can see they've got these nice little walkways throughout the community, and then the homes are kind of staggered, so you're not like really peering into your neighbor's house. They feel like they're kind of private. Each one of them has their own little front patio or stoop. This is like necessary, so I guess the developer put in these storage bins and then like bike storage around too, so you've got some places to store stuff because you don't have a garage if you live here. And then look, so yeah, I mean, it's a 400 square foot footprint, but when you get this loft area included, it brings it up to that 598 square feet. You got your living room, which actually looks like a great size. The kitchen, also a fine size, even has room for an island. They picked out some nice modern finishes. I like it. And then check it out. So it comes with a full-size bathroom with a tub, a shower, a sink, all that. And then on the opposite side of the shower, there's even a couple laundry units. If we pulled up here on Google, so look, I don't know what these houses in the cul-de-sac are. These are obviously a lot bigger, but The 22 houses or tiny homes are all along Wizard Lane, Private Drive, and then some of them are over here off Benham Road. And then let's see, if we drop the little guy down and look at these things from street view, they're small. They definitely just look like sheds, like from this view. But it's cool. Like, I love that the developer did this. All the mailboxes are there in the front. You've got this little private driveway, which takes you to, I'm guessing, just one parking spot per unit. But I don't know. I think it's pretty cool. Let me know what you guys think. Hiatus is an awesome community, but I'm sure they still had to jump through a bunch of red tape to get those approved, because even in Bend, Oregon, there's still some tiny home horror stories. Like, there's this family of 4 who were evicted from their 272 square foot tiny home just a couple years ago. They recently received a notice from the city of Bend that his family wasn't allowed to live in there anymore. Side note, I'm trying to wrap my head around a family of 4 living in a 272 square foot home. That's wild. Apparently, these guys towed this house out to Oregon in 2015 after Steve got out of the Army. They bought a regular house in town, but they decided they wanted to rent out the main house while living in the tiny house that was parked in the backyard. Well, according to this article, the city of Bend actually doesn't allow tiny homes unless they meet what's called the Cottage Code, which does allow homes with no minimum size, but only when a minimum of 12 homes are built in a cluster around a shared open space. I guess that explains why that other Hiatus development was able to be built. It's kind of a weird rule. I don't fully understand it, but I'm sure Bend has their reasoning. These regulations around building tiny homes is definitely one of the bigger drawbacks at this time. Places like Oregon or Seattle or San Francisco might be on board with the whole tiny home movement, but in general, most major cities are not okay with developers building a bunch of 300 square foot homes. Just do a quick Google search and you'll see that there are tiny home communities being built, but most of them are meant for temporarily housing the homeless. But check this out, you guys. Okay, so I was just about to make the point about how where I live is a perfect example of a place where you can't just go build a bunch of tiny houses, but apparently, this article is from way back in 2015. It says tiny house movement comes to Scottsdale. I guess there was this guy Taylor who was in the process at the time of building a 400 square foot home, which would have been Scottsdale's first tiny house. This is what kind of surprised me. This guy actually consulted with Scottsdale's Green Building Program Manager just to make sure that the house would meet city zoning and building requirements. And look what it says here. So Floyd said that Scottsdale's building code requires homes to have at least one room and be more than 120 square feet. So he said as long as the house is built on a residential zone parcel and has a kitchen and plumbing hookups, that it's perfectly legal. Down here he says there's really no limitation or restriction on the type of house you can build. That's not entirely true, but I guess he's trying to say that there's no restriction on square footage. The average house in Scottsdale is 3,500 square feet. Custom built homes are 6,000 square feet. So if this guy ever did build this thing, it would definitely stand out like a sore thumb. But I just spent some time poking around the city of Scottsdale's website. It talks a lot about lot coverage and then setbacks and building height, but I guess they're right. Technically, there's no minimum square footage requirement, which is crazy to me. Here's the thing though, if I pull up Zillow and we sort the homes in Scottsdale from low to high, I mean, check it out. The cheapest houses in Scottsdale are $500,000. So like, let's just say this one, for example, $498. Say you wanted to buy this house for $498, tear it down, and then build a 500 square foot house in its place. You're probably gonna spend at least $250 a square foot to build this tiny house, even if it's very simple, which means that you're gonna be into this for like $650,000 or $700,000 if you bought this, tore it down, and built a tiny house here. And to own a 500 square foot house that you've spent $650,000 on, I can't imagine anyone in their right mind doing that. The New York Times did a great piece on this a few days ago. They're calling the tiny home movement the Great Compression. Pretty clever, by the way. I want to know who came up with that, the Great Compression. That's good. They interviewed a guy named Robert who lives in a 600 square foot house in Redmond, Oregon that he says can be traversed in 5 seconds and vacuumed from a single outlet. But he didn't even move into this new tiny home necessarily to downsize or declutter or just because it's trendy. He did this because it's the only house he could find priced under $300,000. The smallest homes in this community are only 400 square feet. They're a 20 by 20 house attached to a 20 by 20 garage. And Robert's tiny home community in Redmond isn't the only one out there. For price point, things get even better in San Antonio, Texas. There's a community out there called Elm Trails that was developed by Lennar. Here, homes get as small as 350 square feet, and they don't even come with a garage, but you can pick one up for as low as $145,000. Now, I want to be clear, at first glance, $145,000 sounds great. Like, oh wow, you get an entire house with no shared walls for $145,000, but 350 square feet is really, really small. Like I said at the start of this video, the room I'm sitting in is about 100 square feet. So yeah, 350 square feet is tiny. And the thing is, if you're shopping for a house outside of this Lennar community, there are plenty of houses in the $200,000 to $400,000 range that, yeah, they're a little bit older, but they're like 5 times the size. Like look at this one here, $185,000, and it's got 2,057 square feet. Or this one over here, $269,000, and it's got over 1,900 square feet. You guys get the point, and it looks like I'm not the only one who thinks that these tiny houses might be a little bit overpriced. You go to the Elm Trails Google reviews, check this out. This one says, tiny homes, way overpriced, really sad, cars parked in every direction, large garbage cans scattered all over the street. This guy says that the houses are way overpriced with no closets and bathrooms, and they're smaller than a camper. And then Nick says that this company is an embarrassment to the state of Texas, and they deserve to be prosecuted for even trying to sell these. Little harsh, but I get why a lot of these outsiders are feeling this way, because they're driving by and seeing a community of homes that basically looks like a modern version of a mobile home park, and they're priced upwards of $300,000, and they're just like, what the heck? From the developer standpoint though, when you consider how much they had to pay for the land here, they honestly probably can't afford to sell these houses for much less. I mean, they are in the business of making money after all, but what's funny is that in reality, Lennar probably could have just built a massive apartment complex, which would have had a much better public response and probably a much better return. So when you look at it that way, I think it's pretty cool that the developer did something different here. They pushed the boundaries. They definitely took some massive risks by going this direction, but they're offering families a new construction, affordable single-family house that doesn't share walls with anybody like an apartment would. Plus, each one of them even comes with their own small yard. Speaking of building apartments, the New York Times posted their whole piece on Instagram. There are thousands of people who have shared their opinions in the comments section. They just posted this one day ago. And the top comment, of course, is LOL, why not just build apartment buildings? This guy made a great point. He said that America will build anything besides a walkable city with public transportation. I totally feel that. I've been to a few places outside America, like parts of Mexico, Amsterdam, Paris, Japan. These other countries have very, very walkable cities, and for whatever reason here in America, we just like to spread everything out. Nothing's walkable. Like if I wanted to walk to a restaurant from my house right now, and I live in the city, I need to walk for almost a mile before I could even get a bite to eat. This guy Paul says that nobody actually wants this and we're already being squeezed at every end. Irish Pat says that this is dystopia disguised as a trend. That one got a lot of likes. Oh, we did have one person who supports it though. Emily says, am I the only one who's sick of seeing absurdly oversized houses in the suburbs? The amount of wasted material, space, and resources to heat and cool them is disgusting. Tiny homes are not just economical, they're practical and more sustainable, especially for older folks and people who want to live alone. All very good points. I agree with her. Oh yeah, and speaking of Tokyo where I went, so this guy says his 440 square foot house is considered fairly spacious out there in Tokyo. It's all relative. Where I stand on all this is, I guess, I'm a little bit mixed. I mean, no doubt we have a major housing problem in America, some cities worse than others, but in general, we're not building enough houses and housing is just too expensive for the average family. Plus, I know that consumerism in general is healthy for the economy, but I also think that most of us probably own more stuff and have more space than we actually need. As somebody who has lived in several apartments, and to be honest, I really don't love apartments, I'm definitely here for this whole tiny home movement, and I'd like to see more of them. What's really gonna need to happen for us to see more tiny homes built though, is that cities are going to need to get on board with approving these unique communities, and ideally, cities will incentivize developers to build tiny homes through some tax savings or something like that, because otherwise, I don't know how developers are going to be able to ever make the numbers work. One thing's for sure, I'm just gonna put this out in the universe. I might not ever live in a tiny home in the middle of the city, but at some point in life, I fully plan on owning a tiny home somewhere up north in the forest, surrounded by a bunch of trees. I'd like to build it myself, and when that time comes, hopefully I'm still making YouTube videos and I can document the whole process here on the channel. I'll see you guys next time.